We are covering a major story that could reshape the cost of living for millions of people across North America. Early this morning, the White House delivered a difficult choice to Canada. The message from President Donald Trump was direct but serious. Canada has exactly 72 hours to accept a new set of trade rules, or the United States will impose heavy new taxes on its goods. The countdown has already begun. The official document from Washington used polite and calm language. It described the plan as a framework to modernize the relationship between the two countries. But beyond the title, the tone changes. In simple terms, the United States presented Canada with 4 firm demands, and Washington expects Canada to agree to all 4 before any real discussions or meetings even begin. Ottawa recognized this immediately. They did not see an invitation to negotiate. They saw a clear list of conditions. Let us break down exactly what the White House requested today. First, the United States demanded that Canada completely remove all its current taxes on American goods right away. Canada had introduced those taxes earlier in response to previous American trade actions. Now, Washington says they must be removed before any new talks can begin. The U.S. is not offering to remove its own taxes first. Instead, it wants Canada to act first and reset the situation. Second, the White House is asking for strict guarantees on energy pricing. Canada exports a large amount of crude oil, natural gas, and electricity to the United States. The new demand calls for fixed price limits on those resources. Officials in Ottawa quickly pointed out what this means in practice. It would allow the United States government to influence how much Canada can charge for its own natural resources. Third, Washington wants Canada to accept permanent taxes on Canadian steel and aluminum. While the proposal suggests slightly lower rates than current ones, it insists those taxes become permanent. This would effectively lock in a long-term trade barrier between the two countries. Fourth, the White House demanded that Canada immediately align its farming and food safety rules with American standards. This was not presented as a gradual adjustment over time. It was a requirement for a full and immediate adoption of U.S. agricultural laws. When you combine all 4 demands, they go far beyond small adjustments. They would fundamentally change how the two nations conduct trade. These are large structural shifts. Inside the White House today, officials appeared confident. They viewed the 72-hour deadline as a strong and strategic move. The belief is that intense pressure will force a quick decision and deliver a fast win for American workers and farmers. The goal was to create urgency. However, Canada's response was not what Washington expected. The Canadian government reacted quickly. Normally, a country facing a situation like this would take time to evaluate, hold private discussions, and release a detailed statement. That did not happen. Instead, in a room full of reporters in Ottawa, the response came in under 3 minutes. Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped up to the podium. He remained calm and composed. He spoke briefly and clearly. He stated that Canada will not give up control of its laws or natural resources just to enter negotiations. He firmly rejected the idea of another country setting prices on Canadian energy. Then he ended his remarks without taking questions and left the room. That short moment shifted the tone of the entire situation. By responding this way, the Prime Minister sent a clear signal. Canada will not trade its independence to avoid pressure. It was also a calculated political move. By taking a firm public stance so quickly, it becomes very difficult for any future Canadian leader to reverse course. Accepting those demands later would likely face strong public resistance. The reaction in Washington was immediate. The president posted online calling the rejection a major mistake. Officials from the administration appeared on television criticizing Canada and describing the response as uncooperative. Public messaging was sharp and direct, but behind the scenes, the situation is more complex. Inside the Capitol, several lawmakers are becoming concerned. Republican senators and state governors quietly began making calls. These are leaders from regions heavily tied to agriculture and energy. They understand the real cost of a trade conflict. A prolonged dispute with Canada would directly impact their local economies. Lawmakers from border states know that if trade slows or stops, jobs are lost and prices rise. The stock market reflected these concerns. When trading opened Monday morning, investors reacted to the quick response from Ottawa. It became clear that Canada would not back down easily. As a result, investors moved money away from riskier sectors. Energy companies declined. Agricultural equipment firms saw their stock prices drop. Financial markets are preparing for a prolonged conflict. To understand why this situation is so serious, we need to examine a key assumption. The White House believes that the size and strength of the American economy can force other countries to comply under pressure. That may work with smaller economies, but Canada is different. The two economies are deeply interconnected. Trade flows in both directions constantly. Consider the auto industry. A single car part may cross the US-Canada border multiple times during production. Adding taxes or delays increases costs. If costs rise too much, production lines stop. When that happens, workers on both sides lose income. The same applies to energy. The United States relies heavily on Canadian oil and gas. Many American refineries are specifically designed for Canadian crude. Disrupting that supply would cause immediate consequences. Fuel prices would increase. Heating costs in colder regions would rise. Prime Minister Carney and his team understand this clearly. Their quick and firm response reflects that understanding. They know the United States cannot achieve a simple or quick victory in this situation. Instead, they have shifted the pressure back onto Washington. Now, the United States must decide whether it is willing to risk its own supply chains to enforce these demands. There are three possible outcomes, and each one affects everyday life. In the first scenario, internal pressure within the United States grows. Lawmakers, business leaders, and state officials push back strongly. The White House may step away from the strict demands and agree to open discussions without preconditions. Negotiations take place over time, leading to a modest agreement. In this case, economic stability is maintained. In the second scenario, neither side backs down. The 72-hour deadline passes. The United States imposes heavy tariffs, and Canada responds with its own. This leads to supply chain disruptions, reduced factory output, and rising costs. Consumers would feel the impact through higher prices on everyday goods. In the third scenario, Canada holds its position while other global players observe closely. Countries in Europe and Asia may begin to reduce reliance on the United States and strengthen trade ties elsewhere. Canada could expand its trade partnerships beyond North America. Over time, this could reshape global trade dynamics in a lasting way. At this moment, it is unclear which path will unfold. The decision lies with leadership in both Washington and Ottawa. However, the effects will reach households quickly. Economists suggest that if tariffs are implemented, household expenses will rise. Businesses are already preparing. Some will look for alternative suppliers, while others may pass increased costs to consumers. Large corporations may absorb some losses, but smaller businesses face greater risks. Rising material costs can quickly threaten their survival. Workers in manufacturing, energy, and agriculture are closely watching developments. Hiring may slow. Expansion plans could be delayed. In some cases, governments may need to provide financial support to affected communities, though such assistance takes time. Meanwhile, legal teams and diplomats are working behind the scenes. They are reviewing trade agreements and preparing strategies, but public pressure often plays the biggest role in resolving disputes. As costs rise, voters demand action and political leaders respond. This situation differs from typical diplomacy. Usually discussions happen privately before public statements are made. Here the approach was different. The White House used urgency and pressure. Canada responded with firmness and consistency. We will soon see which approach proves more effective. Canada also has alternatives. It has been expanding trade relationships with Europe and Asia. While shipping goods overseas is more complex than cross-border trucking, it remains a viable option. Once new trade routes are established, they tend to remain in place. The United States, however, may find it more difficult to replace Canadian imports, especially in energy. Supply disruptions would be felt quickly by consumers, and rising costs can influence political outcomes. Experts are analyzing every detail of today's events. In diplomacy, language and presentation matter. A short and firm public response can limit future flexibility. That is what we witnessed today. Let me break down what Carney actually said in those 2 minutes, because the words were chosen with precision. He opened by acknowledging the American document directly. He said Canada had reviewed the proposal and understood its implications completely. Then he delivered the rejection in language that left no room for interpretation. Canada will not negotiate its sovereignty. We will not accept foreign control over Canadian energy pricing. We will not remove our retaliatory measures while American tariffs remain in place. And we will not align our agricultural regulations with any country's standards as a precondition for discussion. He paused, looked directly into the camera, and delivered the line that will be quoted for months. The United States can choose to negotiate as equals. It cannot dictate as a superior. That is not how relations between sovereign nations work. Then he walked away. 2 minutes done. The contrast with Washington's 72-hour ultimatum could not be starker. Trump demanded 4 days. Carney answered in 2 minutes. That ratio, 72 hours versus 120 seconds, tells you everything about who controls the pace of this confrontation, and it tells you something even more important about who understands leverage. Let me explain the math that Carney's team had prepared months ago. The 4 American demands were not surprises. Ottawa had seen versions of each in previous negotiations. They had analyzed everyone. The demand to remove Canadian tariffs while American tariffs remain, that was always going to be rejected. It's basic negotiation 101. You don't disarm while the other side keeps firing. The demand for energy price controls that was designed to test whether Canada would trade sovereignty for relief. The answer was no. The permanent steel and aluminum tariffs, those were always going to be non-starters. They lock in damage permanently rather than temporarily. The agricultural alignment demand that was the deal breaker wrapped in diplomatic language. It would have required Canada to rewrite decades of domestic food policy to match American standards. Standards that Canada did not help write and does not control. Each demand was designed to be rejected. The White House knew that. They wanted rejection so they could escalate. That was the trap. Carney saw it, and instead of playing the game they designed, he changed the game entirely. He rejected the framework itself, not just the terms. He said no to the process, not just to the conditions. That is why his response was so fast. Speed was the message. Speed said, we don't need to deliberate on this. We don't need to consult. We don't need to think about it. The answer is no. And it was no before you finished typing the document. Speed also served a strategic purpose. By responding immediately, Carney seized control of the narrative. The story became Canada rejects unreasonable demands in minutes rather than Canada deliberates as deadline approaches. The frame shifted entirely. Now the 72-hour clock is running, but it no longer feels like a deadline. It feels like a countdown to consequences. The United States may not want, because here is what happens when the deadline expires. If Trump imposes the threatened tariffs, he triggers immediate retaliation from Canada. Not delayed retaliation, not negotiated retaliation. Immediate, pre-prepared, designed to maximize political pain in the exact districts where Trump needs support. If Trump does nothing, his threat is exposed as empty. The 72-hour ultimatum becomes a 72-hour embarrassment. Carney has given him no third option. There is no negotiated middle ground because Canada has rejected the process entirely. There is no last-minute phone call to save face because Canada has already said no publicly and permanently. Trump walked into this thinking he had leverage. He left with a 2-minute response that exposed the weakness in his entire approach. Let me give you a more detailed breakdown of the 3 scenarios I mentioned earlier because the details matter for your wallet. Scenario 1, the internal revolt. Over the next 48 hours, Republican senators from farm states and energy-producing regions begin breaking publicly. They release statements calling for de-escalation. They warn that their constituents cannot afford a trade war with Canada. The White House, facing a rebellion in its own party, quietly drops the preconditions and agrees to normal negotiations. Carney, having made his point, agrees to talks without conceding anything. The crisis passes, but the lesson remains. Canada stood firm and won. Scenario 2, the mutual damage. The deadline passes. Trump imposes tariffs. Canada retaliates immediately. Supply chains seize up within days. Auto plants in Michigan and Ohio announce reduced shifts. Energy prices spike in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Lumber costs jump, adding thousands to new home prices. Farmers lose export markets they may never get back. By the time the political pressure forces de-escalation months later, the damage is already done, and it is asymmetrical. America's pain is concentrated in swing states. Canada's pain is national, but Canada's resilience is also national. Both sides lose, but one side loses more. Scenario 3, the permanent realignment. Canada uses the confrontation as the final justification for its trade diversification strategy. The deals with Europe, with Asia, with the Indo-Pacific accelerate. The energy exports that used to flow south now flow east and west. The United States becomes just another customer, not the customer. The integrated North American economy that has defined the continent for 3 generations begins to decouple. Not completely, but significantly. And once that process starts, it does not reverse. I do not know which scenario will unfold. Nobody does. But I know which one Carney is preparing for. He is preparing for all of them because that is what disciplined leaders do. They build options. They create flexibility. They ensure that no matter what happens, their country can survive and thrive. And right now, Canada has more options than Trump ever anticipated. We will continue monitoring developments, including border activity, market trends, and industry responses. Each update provides insight into how this situation may evolve. For now, the key takeaway is simple. A major set of demands was met with a direct and immediate rejection. The result is uncertainty. The next 48 hours are critical. This situation also tests a broader idea. It questions whether economic size alone can dictate outcomes. The United States is relying on its scale and influence. Canada is relying on mutual dependence. The outcome will shape trade relationships for years to come. For individuals, the impact is practical. Food prices, fuel costs, and job stability may all be affected. Decisions made now could influence personal finances in the near future. Looking at agriculture, cross-border trade plays a vital role. Farmers depend on stable markets. Sudden changes in tariffs or regulations can disrupt that balance. Crops may go unsold and costs may rise, affecting entire rural communities. Construction is also at risk. Steel and aluminum are essential materials. Permanent tariffs would increase building costs, affecting housing and infrastructure projects. When costs rise, projects are delayed or canceled, leading to job losses. Legal disputes may take years to resolve, but economic effects happen immediately. That is why stability is so important in trade policy. Sudden changes create uncertainty, and uncertainty affects investment. For those planning ahead, financial experts recommend reviewing budgets and preparing for possible increases in transportation and food costs. Business owners should communicate with suppliers and explore backup options. There is no need for panic, but planning is important. The next 2 days will be decisive. Tensions may ease or they may escalate. Global observers are watching closely. If a close ally faces this level of pressure, it may influence how other countries approach trade relationships. We will continue providing clear and factual updates as events unfold. The situation is evolving quickly and the outcomes will have real-world consequences. For now, the situation stands as follows. A 72-hour deadline has been issued. A firm rejection has been delivered. The timeline is active. We will see what comes next. 72 hours versus 2 minutes. That is the ratio that will define this confrontation. And in trade policy, as in life, speed is not just speed. Speed is a statement. Speed is leverage. Speed is power. Canada just proved it. Understands all three. Stay informed with BCC News. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a critical update.